He is not the first name you hear when the story of the Jacksons is told. But without him, the story loses its center of gravity. Jermaine Jackson, that steady flame in the middle of a storm, the older brother who carried both the music and the weight of the family name. From a narrow house in Gary, Indiana, to stages that shook beneath the roar of millions, his journey has always been more than fame. It has been about endurance, about walking through fire and insisting on love anyway. The world sees the polished photographs, the seamless harmonies, the myth of a perfect musical dynasty. But beneath that myth is a boy who learned too early that success can cost you almost everything, including the right to be a child. Now, at 70, when life has already taken so many faces he loved, one lost towers above the rest, the day he had to accept that Michael Jackson was gone forever. For the world, it was the end of an era. For Jermaine, it was like the ground disappearing beneath an older brother who had spent his whole life holding the line. That heartbreak did not arrive all at once. It had been building since the first time they stepped onto a stage together, since long nights in cramped rooms where music was the only protection against poverty and fear. His story is not just about the heights he reached, but the shadows that followed him every step of the way, before the glitter, before the headlines. There was a small house on Jackson Street that seemed too tight to hold all the lives inside it. Jermaine Jackson was born on December 11th, 1954, in Gary, Indiana. The fourth of 10 children, a working class, African-American family that had no idea the world would one day know their name. His early life unfolded between thin walls and crowded rooms, where privacy was a luxury and survival a daily task. 11 souls pushed into a 2-bedroom house meant that nights looked like a patchwork of bodies sleeping top to tail, feet touching in the dark, dreams sharing the same cramped air. The kitchen turned into everything at once: dining room, homework table, rehearsal studio, and a small sanctuary where imagination stretched far beyond the peeling paint and worn floors. His father, Joseph, always Joseph, never Dad, came home from the steel mill coated in dust, the weight of long shifts clinging to his shoulders. At night, he chased a different life with a guitar in his hands, that instrument becoming the first doorway out of the mill and out of Gary, even if he could not yet see it clearly. He believed discipline could build a bridge to something better, and he delivered that discipline with a force that left marks on the children's talent and on their hearts. His mother, Catherine, soft-voiced and already exhausted, took part-time work at Sears, quietly carrying her own unfulfilled dreams. She held a gentle spirit and a faith that wrapped the children in strict rules and religious certainty. Their home was bound by Jehovah's Witness teachings that allowed little room for celebration. No birthdays, no Christmas. Obedience over indulgence. Duty over play. Even before Jermaine's first cry echoed in that tiny house, tragedy had already passed through. In 1957, Marlon's twin brother Brandon died shortly after birth, a loss that seeped into the family like permanent winter. That absence became its own presence, a silent grief that lingered at the edges of every gathering, every photograph that should have had one more face in it. Jermaine grew up beneath that shadow. Love existed, but it was strained, thinned out by poverty, fear, and unspoken pain. His parents' marriage was a paradox anchored by commitment, frayed by hardship. Whispers of Joseph's infidelity drifted through the walls, unconfirmed but heavy, adding to the tension. The rules were strict, the punishments real, and tenderness often swallowed by responsibility. For Jermaine, childhood was not a landscape of toys and lazy afternoons. It was a regimen. Less affection, more directives. Fewer games, more rehearsals. Mistakes were not simply corrected, they were punished. He and his siblings learned early that their dreams were welcome only if those dreams could carry the whole family somewhere beyond the steel mill and the cramped house. Within this pressure cooker, talent began to surface like sparks off flint. The Jackson children hummed and tapped and sang in every corner, melodies weaving through the noise of daily struggle. And in the middle of it all, quiet, watchful, and already bearing the weight of expectation, stood Jermaine, trying to figure out who he was in a family where talent erupted in every direction. The turning point did not look like destiny. It looked like disobedience. One day, Tito, ignoring rigid rules, picked up Joseph's treasured guitar, the one object he was absolutely forbidden to touch, and began to play. A snapped string should have spelled disaster, should have triggered the fury they all feared. Instead, it opened a door. Joseph, ready to scold, stopped cold when he heard the sound. He ordered Tito to play again. Notes fell into the air, uncertain but undeniable. In that living room, with its worn furniture and too many children squeezed onto sofas and floors, something enormous began to take shape. Soon Tito, Jackie, and Jermaine were rehearsing under their father's watchful, unforgetting eye. Their home transformed into a training ground. Where other kids played outside, the Jackson boys drilled harmonies inside, repetition carving precision into their voices and movements. Then a small body began to orbit their rehearsals, eyes wide, voice startlingly powerful little Michael, barely 5, absorbing every rhythm, every step, every breath. When he opened his mouth, it was as though the air itself shifted. The baby of the family stole every gaze, every silence, with a sound that was somehow both raw and refined. Out of that unplanned audition, the Jackson 5 took shape, a band not born in luxury or chance, but in discipline, desperation, and a single broken guitar string dot as time moved forward. Local shows gave way to regional gigs. School gymnasiums turned into clubs, church halls into competition stages. Behind every performance was Joseph's relentless drive. Rehearsals were long, breaks short, and excuses non-existent. Jermaine's bass lines began to anchor their sound, his voice wrapping around harmonies like silk. Even as his younger brother's star began to blaze, he found his own quiet power, a calm intensity that steadied the group. For all the chaos at home, something undeniable was emerging. This family was not ordinary, and the world was about to find out. The moment came in March 1969, when Motown Records put ink to paper. The Jackson 5 were signed. In an instant, the edges of their lives blurred. Gary, with its smokestacks and narrow streets, faded into the distance as they moved to California, trading the gray skies of Indiana for the bright, unreal glare of Encino and Los Angeles. Jermaine, barely into his mid-teens, felt his childhood snap away like a rope cut clean. One day he was just a boy squeezed into a crowded house. The next he was a working artist expected to be flawless under lights hotter than the sun, while boys his age were running across playgrounds or worrying about homework and high school crushes. Jermaine was walking through airports, hotel lobbies, and backstage tunnels. His classroom became tour buses and dressing rooms. The schedule was merciless clubs, talent showcases, televised appearances, endless rehearsals. The stage swallowed his adolescence whole. In the glare of television cameras, he stood in matching outfits beside his brothers, singing to audiences who screamed his name as though he had always belonged to them. Fame didn't glide in gracefully. It slammed into him. By 1969, at just 14, he was part of a group that Motown shaped with almost military precision. Wake-up calls before dawn, vocal drills until his throat felt raw. Choreography run again and again until legs trembled. Interviews practiced so carefully that spontaneity became a luxury he rarely experienced. The Jackson 5 were not simply a band. They were a brand. Every movement, every smile, every gesture needed to be polished. Under that gloss, inside those suits and sparkling performances, was a teenager trying not to be crushed under the weight of Expectation. Jermaine's voice became a signature element of the group's sound smooth. Deep and comforting, the steady counterpart to Michael's explosive energy. He was not just a background figure. He was co-lead, the warm presence that gave their songs balance. Yet as crowds grew louder, something complicated grew inside him. Every ovation for Michael was a surge of pride and quietly a small sting. It wasn't jealousy, not in its simplest form. It was the ache of standing inches away from someone you love while the world increasingly crowns them alone. The more cameras turned toward his younger brother, the more invisible he sometimes felt in the photographs they were all standing in. Still, when the music started, he did what he had always done. He showed up. He played the bass until calluses hardened his fingertips, adding the heartbeat to songs that would define a generation. He learned to interact with fans, to smile through exhaustion, to be the steady presence the family leaned on both on stage and off. Backstage, while chaos swirled, he often took on the unspoken role of older brother anchor, helping calm nerves, smoothing disagreements, making sure Michael and the younger siblings could keep going. It wasn't a job anyone gave him. It was simply what he did. The price was immense. Their calendar filled with hundreds of shows a year. Flights stacked on flights. Sleep came in fragments. There were nights when his hands shook so badly before a performance that he had to pause to fasten his own buttons. Yet when the curtain rose, he stepped out with practiced confidence because failure wasn't an option. The family's future was tied to every note, every step. And more than anything, he had been taught that saying no to the job was the same as saying no to survival. Music. The early 1970s felt like a non-stop explosion. I Want You Back shot to #1 in 1970, and Jermaine was just 15 when his voice and bass lines helped carry it there. The success came so fast it barely left room to breathe. ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There followed, each hit solidifying the Jackson 5 as a cultural force. In arenas packed wall to wall, his honey-rich vocals floated across seas of faces, while his bass hummed through the floorboards. Fans fainted, cried, reached out with hands that trembled. The band was hailed as a miracle, a phenomenon, a sign that something entirely new had arrived. From the outside, it looked like everything a young performer could want: fame, money, adoration. But inside, the reality was harsher. The schedule was backbreaking. Sometimes it felt as if the group existed in a loop plane: hotel, rehearsal, performance, interview, back to the plane. School was squeezed into the margins. Friendships beyond the group were almost impossible to maintain, and any sense of normal teenage life evaporated. For Jermaine, the line between who he was and who he had to be in front of the cameras grew more and more blurred. Motown's meticulous. Control left little room for individuality. Songs were tailored, appearances organized, press narratives shaped, all to maintain an image. Michael was the designated focal point, the spark that ignited every room they walked into. Producers built arrangements around him. Cameramen naturally gravitated toward his face. Fans screamed his name first. Jermaine understood why that voice, that presence, that rare kind of magic. But understanding didn't entirely protect him from the quiet sorrow of wondering whether the world would ever see him fully, night after night. He walked off stage and into dressing rooms humming with leftover noise. There, in the brief silence before the next obligation, he sometimes sat with his mic still in hand, feeling like the applause had gone through him instead of into him. He had given everything, and yet questions lingered. Did anyone hear his voice as his own? Did anyone recognize the steady force he provided? Or was he destined to be remembered only as Michael's older brother, the one standing slightly to the side in every shot? Still, he refused to let bitterness root itself in his heart. Whatever ache he carried, He refused to aim it at Michael. Pride in his brother's genius always outweighed the pangs of invisibility. He chose, again and again, to love from beside the spotlight rather than fight for its center. And in that choice, he began to forge a different kind of legacy, one built not on domination, but on loyalty, resilience, and grace under pressure. Music. Then came 1975, the year that drove a wedge through the center of the family's professional world. The Jacksons were preparing to leave Motown and join a new label. Contracts needed to be broken, relationships reshaped. For most of the brothers, the decision meant freedom to write more, to own their work in a different way, to step out of restrictive control. For Jermaine, it was far more complicated. He had ties to Motown that went beyond business. That label had been the vehicle for his entire rise, the structure that had defined his life since early adolescence. He found himself on a fault line, forced to choose between two loyalties that both felt sacred, the brothers who shared his blood, and the musical home that had given them their first ascent. At just 21, he faced a decision that would have tested men twice his age. Sitting alone in studio rooms, staring at paperwork that outlined his options, he knew that no path forward was painless. If he left with his brothers, he would be turning his back on Motown. If he stayed, he risked separating himself from the very unit that had carried him since childhood. In the end, he chose to remain with the label. It was not an act of rebellion against his family, but a decision born from loyalty of a different kind and a belief that he could stand on his own feet musically. Watching his brothers walk away was like feeling a part of himself peel off and move out of reach. The public called it business. For him, it was heartbreak. Yet he didn't fold. He dug deeper. He stepped forward into solo work with a determination forged from all those years of pressure and discipline. The late 1970s and early 1980s became the proving ground. Early solo projects gave him room to explore, to shape his own sound without the constant comparison of standing on stage beside his siblings. And then in 1980 came a defining moment, collaborating in the studio with Stevie Wonder on Let's Get Serious. The album that followed did more than earn radio play and sales. When the title track climbed into the Billboard Top 10 and the project sold in the millions, it felt at last like a vindication. For a shining moment, the spotlight focused squarely on him. Critics who had dismissed him as simply part of the group took notice. The world heard what he had always known. He had his own voice, his own lane, his own artistry, but music shifts quickly. The 1980s brought waves of new sounds, new faces, and one kingdom-defining phenomenon, Thriller. As Michael ascended into a realm beyond celebrity, becoming a symbol recognized in every corner of the globe, Jermaine watched with layered emotions. Pride radiated from him as he saw his younger brother reach heights none of them had imagined. At the same time, the industry's attention narrowed even more, making his own audience feel smaller, the stages less grand. Bookings changed. Charts cooled. The gap between the myth of the Jacksons and the reality of Jermaine's day-to-day life widened. He did not disappear. Instead, he adapted. The 1990s drew him into a new role, not simply as a performer, but as the guardian of a legacy. The spokesperson for a family the world never stopped dissecting. He stood in front of cameras again, this time not to sing, but to defend, to explain, to shield. By the time the 2000s arrived, he had become more than a former teen idol. He was the survivor of an industry that devoured many. A man who had risen, fallen, and risen again. Not with the same blinding intensity as his brother, but with a steady perseverance that kept the family's story from being told. Without him, he learned that heroism is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like the older brother who keeps showing up, the one who carries the burden of interviews, who absorbs criticism, who supports tributes. who keeps the name alive not through spectacle but through sheer endurance. Long before life brought him its heaviest loss, he had already proved something essential. You do not need a crown to bleed for a throne. You do not need to stand in the center of the spotlight to be the heart that keeps the music beating. There is a cost to standing inside a miracle. The world remembers the glittering performances and perfect harmonies, but not the fractures hidden behind the curtain. For Jermaine Jackson, being at the core of the most famous musical family on earth meant carrying tensions that no crowd could see. The Jackson story gleams in the spotlight, yet once the lights go down, it cuts. Because even in a band built on love and rhythm, pressure can twist the air between brothers Dot as the 1970s rolled forward. He and Michael often shared the same microphone, the same verses, the same applause. But fame warps gravity. It tilts the room so that praise flows more heavily toward one side. As Michael's genius burst forward, producers, executives, and cameras began to orbit him. Not from cruelty, but from instinct. The youngest brother was a phenomenon. Still, that shift left invisible bruises in places no one talked about. Studio sessions sometimes turned sharp suggestions turning into disagreements. Creative instincts clashing under the watchful eyes of people who cared more about hits than about harmony at home. It wasn't hatred. It was heartbreak's quieter cousin, the feeling of being pulled apart by forces that had nothing to do with how much love remained between them. Jermaine stood only inches away on stage, yet sometimes felt the industry tugging them along different tracks. He was proud when Michael soared. He always was. But pride does not erase the ache of becoming softer in the mix of a duet you once helped define, then the year. That had already changed everything on paper, became a cleaver in the heart. 1975, the decision for the brothers to leave. The label that raised them felt like thunder shaking the foundation of their lives. To the outside world, it was a business move, part of the evolution of a superstar family. To Jermaine, it was a test of loyalty sharper than any contract clause. His connection to Motown ran deeper than headlines. It was where he had found his voice, where his youth had been spent, where every early victory had been carved out when he chose to stay while his brothers moved on. The split was more emotional than geographical. They would see each other, talk, even reunite down the road, but something had shifted. Once, they had moved as a single unit, like fingers on the same hand. Now, paths diverged. When he later rejoined them under their new banner, happiness and tension traveled together. There were hugs, laughter, and old jokes, but also new questions. The group had grown. So had the stakes. Jackie, Taito, and Marlon leaned toward reinvention, hungry to adapt to new sounds and new expectations. Jermaine, scarred by what it meant to lose control of your own story, worried that changing too much would erase the very soul that had lifted them out of Gary Dott's sometimes rehearsals. Felt less like practice and more like negotiation. Ideas collided. Voices rose, then fell into long silences. No one was truly the villain. Each brother simply defended what he believed would keep them alive in an unforgiving business. Once again, Jermaine found himself in the middle historian of their roots, mediator of clashing visions and human shield absorbing the blows so the harmony could survive. It was a role no one assigned, yet he shouldered it anyway, even as fatigue etched itself into the lines of his face. The younger brother who added his own wild energy, Randy, brought another kind of challenge. If Jermaine was considered calculated and composed, Randy was momentum incarnate, bold, spirited, pushing forward without always looking down at the ledge beneath them. Their dynamic was not based on simple rivalry, but on two tempos trying to share the same song. One trying to hold the foundation, the other driving toward the edge. Their disagreements weren't tabloid explosions. They were accumulated arguments in hallways, creative debates in dressing rooms, smoldering misunderstandings that came from two men who cared too much about the same fragile thing, the family's name. Over time, respect grew, but not without cost. Being the one who keeps the peace is rarely peaceful. Jermaine learned that the person standing between worlds, the past and the future, caution and risk often walks away with the deepest bruises. The 1990s brought a new kind of battlefield. Songs and choreography weren't the weapons anymore. Words were. As the media turned increasingly predatory, the Jackson name became less of a blessing and more of a target. Rumors, accusations, and narratives twisted out of context began to flood newspapers and screens. The family had to decide who would speak and who would remain silent, who would step into the camera's crosshairs and who would stand in the background. Hoping the storm would pass, Jermaine stepped forward. Not because he craved attention, but because he understood that silence could sometimes be mistaken for surrender. He chose to speak for the family, to defend, to clarify, to push back when the world turned their pain into spectacle. The task was punishing. Every word was dissected. Every appearance risked more criticism. But he saw it as his responsibility. Another weight he was uniquely shaped to carry. Then a different kind of wound emerged from within. When LaToya chose to share her own account of the family's history, it shook the already fragile image of unity. For Jermaine, it was less about public reaction and more about the ache of seeing his siblings' hurt spill into public view. He did not stop loving her. He did not rage against her. He mourned the distance their pain had carved between them. To be a Jackson was to live in a constant intersection of loyalty, individuality, and scrutiny. Every choice any of them made rippled through the rest. By the time the new millennium arrived, Jermaine had become something that rarely makes headlines. The emotional spine of a family everyone assumed they already understood. He had endured comparisons to his younger brother, creative disputes with the older ones, and the impossible role of being a spokesperson for people still processing their own wounds. He failed sometimes, stumbled, made decisions he would come to regret. Yet he kept getting back up. He discovered that real strength is not polished. It is scarred. And the harmony he fought for wasn't about perfect agreement. It was about imperfect hearts returning to the same table again and again, refusing to let fractures define the end of the song. In the middle of this whirlwind, there were chapters that did not unfold under stage lights, but around kitchen tables and in quiet rooms where no crowd could cheer him on. If the pressures of fame sculpted him, it was love and its breaking that exposed the most vulnerable parts of who he was. When he met Hazel Gordy in the early 1970s, it did not feel like an extension of the spotlight. If anything, it felt like a gentle shield against it. Hazel, the daughter of Motown founder Berry Gordy, had grown up in a world of platinum plaques and studio legends, but she carried herself without the arrogance that fame so often breeds. Where his life was constant motion, her presence felt like stillness. Where his days were packed with travel and noise, time with her felt like a room with open windows and soft light. They were young, hopeful, and untested. He believed that if anything could balance the chaos of superstardom, it might be building a home with someone who understood the business but cared more about the person than the brand. They married in December 1973. Two hearts making vows under the weight of a name the whole world recognized. For a while, that recognition didn't matter. There were mornings when the most important sound was the clatter of dishes and the murmur of private jokes, not the roar of a crowd. Late evenings when his bass lines were not for a stadium, but for the kitchen or the living room, playing quietly while Hazel rested against him, both of them pretending the outside world could be kept at bay. The blessing of children deepened that illusion. Their first child arrived in 1977, and something in him broke open. He had performed for millions, but nothing had ever made his hands shake the way holding his newborn did. A year later, their daughter came, and the sound of little footsteps, giggles, and toys on the floor filled their home with a different kind of music. For a while, they believed they had built something separate from the industry, a sanctuary where the Jackson last name didn't mean obligation, but family, yet even sanctuaries can crack under pressure. Hazel valued routines, dinners where everyone sat together, birthdays marked by presents rather than gifts, evenings where the most important appointment was simply being home on time. But his life was still ruled by touring calendars, studio bookings, late-night sessions, and obligations that always seemed to multiply without warning. Every tour took another chunk out of the time they had together. Every canceled plan, every missed moment chipped away at her sense of security. Love did not vanish overnight. It frayed slowly, thread by thread. There were nights when he walked through the door late, the food on the table grown cold, and found Hazel sitting quietly, expression tired rather than angry, eyes that asked questions his schedule could not answer. He wanted to explain, to promise it would get easier, to hold her as long as it took for her doubt to soften. But exhaustion is a thief. It stole his words as surely as time stole their chances. Silence settled in the spaces where conversation used to be. Little misunderstandings grew into invisible walls. Their third child's arrival in 1987 seemed, for a moment, like a second spring. Baby clothes reappeared in the house. Lullabies returned. There was laughter again in the late hours, the particular warmth that only a newborn can bring. They both tried to believe that this fresh start could mend what distance and fatigue had weakened. But the truth remained unspoken and unresolved. Love cannot fully thrive on leftover time, on whatever remains after work, travel, and responsibility have taken their share. By 1988, the quiet between them was louder than any argument could have been. Hazel's tears often came without raised voices in private rooms where he was not around to see them. He found himself performing smiles in public and going numb in private. They still cared. They still respected each other, but they were no longer moving at the same emotional pace. The marriage that once felt like a harbor had become a place where both were slowly drowning. The day the papers were signed, it was not chaos that marked the moment, but stillness. His hand shook over the ink, knowing that he was closing a chapter that had once held his brightest hopes. Hazel slipped the ring off her finger calmly, with a composure that hurt more than any shouted accusation. The logistics were managed on paper division of property, arrangements for the children, agreements that sounded so clinical compared to the life they were severing. The real loss could not be itemized. When he stepped outside afterward, the air felt different. Lighter in some ways, heavier in others. He had faced thousands of audiences without trembling, but this form of finality left him rattled to his core. At home, rooms looked unfamiliar, emptier even when objects remained in their place. Toys sat untouched. He would pause at the doorway of the playroom, realizing how many milestones had passed while he was on a stage somewhere, singing to people who would never know his children's middle names. Hazel moved forward with a quiet strength, focusing on stability, raising their children with as much normalcy as she could in a world that obsessively watched their last name. She honored what had been good without pretending the painful parts didn't exist. And in that, she showed a grace he never forgot. The unraveling of their marriage did not come from nowhere. Behind the scenes, before anyone signed anything, there were choices that carved wounds so deep they would echo for decades. In the mid-1980s, while still married to Hazel, he crossed a line that turned private restlessness into undeniable betrayal. It did not happen in a moment of confusion, but through decisions that accumulated quietly, until one day there was no way to pretend his life was still singular. Moving toward. Margaret Maldonado, while still bound to Hazel, was a step he knew would hurt the woman who had built a home with him. No explanation could soften that truth. No excuse could erase the impact. When Margaret brought their son Jeremy into the world in 1986, joy and remorse collided violently inside him. He loved his son from the first breath. Yet every time he held that small body, he felt the crushing awareness that another home, another heart, had been broken to make space for this new life. He was no longer living one story. He was trying to inhabit two different worlds that could never truly meet. On one side, a marriage quietly disintegrating, its pain still unspoken. On the other, a new connection rooted not in stability, but in the ruins of what had already fallen apart. With the divorce from Hazel finalized in 1988, the legal lines were drawn, but the emotional chaos remained. When Jordan was born in 1989, he now had 4 children spread between 2 households, bound together by a father who could never fully be present in any one place at all times. The public saw fragments, headlines, glimpses, speculation. What they didn't see were the nights he sat alone, hands gripping the steering wheel in a parked car, unable to walk through the front door because he dreaded confronting the version of himself he had become. They didn't see the letters he began, confessions and apologies written to Hazel, only to crumple them up before they could ever be mailed. There was no speech capable of stitching back together a heart you had helped break. Margaret, too, carried her own unspoken ache. Whatever tenderness existed between them was tangled from the start in guilt, uncertainty, and the knowledge that their story had begun in the long shadow of another woman's sorrow. Loving someone while knowing your connection emerged from the ruins of another life is not a simple romance. It is a slow, quiet war inside the soul. She was not a spectacle, not an easy label. She was a human being who had stepped into a life already in pieces, tasked with building something steady atop shifting ground. By 1993, that ground finally gave way. Their relationship did not end in explosive scenes. It ended like something worn out, conceding that it could no longer hold its own weight. Too many unspoken fears, too many nights where honesty felt too sharp to touch. What remained was not clean closure, but a lingering sense of regret and hard-earned understanding. He realized that a man can genuinely love his children and still make choices that cause them pain. That some mistakes don't vanish with time. They settle in the bones as permanent reminders of what silence and avoidance can cost. The story between him and Margaret was never about villains or heroes. It was about human fragility, about what happens when people try to build a future while still bleeding from the past. They parted not in hatred, but in recognition that what they had been to each other was real, but also born under a light that was never meant to last. And in the echoes of that chapter, another truth took root inside him. Love that begins in shadows rarely finds peace under the full glare of day. There are moments in a man's life when the ground shifts so violently that nothing afterward feels steady again. After Jermaine Jackson walked away from the ashes of one heartbreak, life did not give him time to rebuild his footing. Instead, it placed him in the center of a situation so volatile, so tangled in family history that the very foundation beneath him trembled. By 1995, he was a man carrying too many unfinished endings divorce behind him. Another relationship dissolved, children in multiple homes, loyalty and regret braided into every decision he made. He was still standing, but on a fault line. And into that fault line stepped someone he already knew, Alejandra Genevieve Otsiaza, a woman interwoven with the Jackson family long before he ever reached for her hand. She had been in their world for years. Raising 2 children with his younger brother Randy, she was familiar, a constant presence in the corridors of the Jackson home, someone who knew the rhythms of their family better than most. When feelings sparked between them, it was not a whisper, it was an earthquake. Whatever tenderness drew them together arrived wrapped in complexity so sharp it left marks. No one in the family could truly escape the shockwave of what came next. And yet, despite every voice of caution, every shadow cast by the circumstances, they married in 1995, not in secrecy, not hidden away, but in full view of a world eager to turn their story into headlines. For many, it was scandal. For them, it was an attempt to build something steady out of two bruised hearts trying to find shelter inside the noise. There were moments the world never saw, late-night conversations when exhaustion softened the edges. Mornings where they clung to each other as though closeness might protect them from public judgment. Quiet hours when the harshness of reality faded long enough for tenderness to breathe. They were flawed together, hopeful together, and burdened together. When their first son, Jafar, was born in 1996, the weight on Jermaine's shoulders shifted. In that tiny life, he saw a fresh chance to get right what had gone so wrong in years prior. He spoke softly to that newborn, whispering promises built from equal parts remorse and resolve. Promises that he would be present, that he would do better, that his past would not define the man he intended to become. Their second son, Jermaine, arrived in 2000, and joy swept through the household like light breaking after a long storm. Photos from those years show him smiling more softly, touching his children's heads with a tenderness that felt like prayer. But joy, especially in a life shaped by relentless expectations, does not erase pressure. It merely pauses at dot by the early 2000s. Reality closed in dot to the outside world. He was still a Jackson, a name synonymous with stardom, wealth, and legacy. But inside his private life, his finances had begun to collapse. Child support for multiple households mounted. Obligations multiplied faster than income. Royalty checks came unpredictably. Bookings were inconsistent. The life of a teen superstar does not guarantee the life of a middle-aged man without the same spotlight. During some publicly documented periods, his income dipped to around $1,100 a month, an unthinkable number for someone who had once performed for crowds so large they looked like oceans. But fame is not a lifetime insurance policy, and when responsibility stretches across several families, even a steady stream of shows and appearances can begin to crack under the weight those accumulated. Support agreements overlapped in ways no ordinary household could withstand. School tuition, medical needs, daily necessities, travel costs, legal expenses. Even groceries became part of a balancing act that seemed designed to fail. Alejandra, navigating her own emotional storms while raising two young sons under harsh public scrutiny, felt the strain as well. Their home became a place of whispered discussions, tired sighs, and attempts to stretch hope across bills that refused to shrink. Arguments didn't explode. They faded in like fog soft at first, then suddenly everywhere. Two people slowly losing the ability to meet each other's eyes without seeing the weight behind them. By the mid-2000s, their house no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a waiting room for an ending neither wanted but both sensed was coming dot in 2008. The marriage dissolved not in flames, but in exhaustion. Paperwork signed quietly, hearts surrendering softly. A 13-year bond flattened into legal lines. But even after the divorce, another blow awaited dot in 2009. Alejandra filed court documents seeking child support enforcement, and suddenly every private struggle spilled into public record. The numbers were stark reports indicating more than $35,000 in overdue. Support across responsibilities that had grown too vast for one man to manage. Legal warnings arrived like waves, suspended licenses, potential garnishments, threats of asset seizure, and then the courtroom, under bright institutional lights, where faces appear harsh and every sound echoes. He stood before a judge who saw columns of expenses, not decades of music. statements of income, lists of dependents, past due amounts, his life reduced to printouts and signatures. Yet behind those sterile pages, he saw children, 7 lives tethered to his name, 7 futures shaped by every choice, every mistake, every fractured chapter explaining that collapse. Acknowledging that the life of a former star could crumble so completely was a deeper humiliation than any tabloid headline. But shame was never the root of his grief. His sorrow came from the faces he saw in his mind: Jafar, Dermajesti, Jeremy, Jordan, and all the others who depended on him to stand, even when standing became a war. Through all of it, he never denied responsibility, never tried to escape. He simply fought day after day to rebuild what had fallen apart. And though bruised, financially battered, and deeply humbled, he kept going because love is not measured in money. It is measured in the perseverance to show up even when the world thinks you have nothing left. But life was not finished with him yet. In 2004, before the ink on one marriage had even fully dried, another chapter began, one unlike the fiery, tangled stories that came before it. This time, love did not crash into him like a storm. It entered quietly, like someone opening a window after years of stale air. Her name was Halima Rashid. He met her while still entangled in the remnants of his 1990s marriage, living in a strange limbo between endings and beginnings. He was a man pulled in too many directions, financially strained, emotionally stretched, spiritually searching. In that fragile state, Halima did not enter his life with chaos. She entered with calm. Educated, compassionate, composed, she carried herself with a groundedness he had not felt in years. She did not come from the world of fame. She came from a world of clarity. Their conversations stretched long into the night, not about tours or tabloids, but about culture, faith, philosophy, and healing. She saw the man beneath the name. He saw the possibility of peace after a lifetime of noise. Their connection was not fireworks. It was warmth, not spectacle, but quiet understanding. And when they married in 2004, even with threads of the past still unraveling behind them, it was not impulsive, it was hopeful. An act of 2 souls trying to build something steadier than anything either had known before. They spent much of their time moving between Los Angeles, Bahrain, and Dubai, building a life defined not by crowds, but by privacy. No children, no public fights, no scandals. For 13 years, she was the longest-standing calm he had ever known. Their home was filled with routines, shared meals, morning prayers, long talks, evenings without cameras. She gave him what he had been searching for since childhood: stability, without performance. But peace is hard to maintain when a man is still reckoning with his past. As the 2000s became the 2010s, pressures that had been dormant began to rise again. Child support obligations continued. Financial fluctuations remained severe. Touring slowed. Expenses grew. And Halima, patient as she was, could not always shoulder the weight of everything he carried. They did not fall apart in one moment. It happened slowly: little misunderstandings, postponed conversations, long silences. The kind that build into a wall before either person realizes they're on opposite sides of it. And then in 2016, during one painful argument that escalated under emotional strain, an incident occurred that led to Halima's brief arrest. Charges later dropped. It was a symbolic breaking point. The sound of a fragile piece finally fracturing. In 2016, their marriage ended. Not with cruelty, not with blame, but with the weary acceptance that love was no longer strong enough to bridge the distance between the life he lived and the life she needed. Their divorce finalized quietly, respectfully. No televised accusations, no media spectacle, Just two people acknowledging that even sincere love can falter under the weight of unresolved burdens. Their 13 years together became a testament not of triumph, but of effort. A reminder that sometimes the greatest kindness two people can show each other is letting go, but nothing, no divorce, no audience lost, no financial collapse would ever deliver the devastation that came. On June 25th, 2009, the world remembers where it was that day. When the news broke, when television anchors stopped mid-sentence, when strangers cried in public, when cities held vigils before sunset. But for Jermaine, the moment was far more than global shock. It was the shattering of a bond formed in a two-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana. A bond forged in shared harmonies, shared fears, shared triumphs, and shared pain. Michael Jackson, gone at 50. The younger brother he once shared a bed with, the boy whose small hand had clung to his backstage, the genius he had protected, competed with, admired, argued with, forgiven, and loved more deeply than he had ever been able to say aloud. Michael's absence became a silence so vast it swallowed every room. He had never imagined a world without him. Comment 70 or right. R.I.P. Jermaine Jackson. To honor him. Asterisk. The news rippled through the world like a shockwave, breaking through television screens, car radios, whispered phone calls, and trembling voices that could barely form the words. Michael Jackson gone. A sentence impossible to grasp, a reality too cruel to accept. Outside, crowds erupted into grief as though the earth itself had split open. But inside Jermaine's chest, the collapse was quieter, deeper, a falling without end. Because long before the world crowned Michael a legend, he had been his baby brother in a cramped bedroom on Jackson Street, sharing blankets, sharing fears, sharing the dream that music could lift them all to someplace brighter than Gary's gray skies. And now that brother, his shadow, his mirror, his companion through both triumph and terror, was lost forever. Music, and the hours after Michael's passing, Los Angeles felt heavy, as if the air itself refused to move. Reporters gathered outside UCLA Medical Center. Helicopters hovered overhead. Fans clung to each other on sidewalks. But inside Jermaine's heart, grief did not roar. It whispered. It whispered of all the words he wished he had spoken when time was still generous. Of apologies not made. Of moments taken for granted. Of childhood alleys and living rooms, where they once dreamed without knowing they were building a global legacy. Michael had always been more than a star. He was the child who squeezed Jermaine's hand before stepping onto their first big stage. The teenager who stayed late in rehearsal rooms trying to perfect one more spin, one more note. The adult who carried the crushing expectation of millions, but still looked to his older brother for grounding. They had loved each other in the complicated way siblings do, deeply, imperfectly, fiercely. And now, with Michael gone, Jermaine felt the shape of that love turning into a wound that would never fully heal. The funeral on July 7th, 2009, was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. More than 20,000 mourners filled the Staples Center. Another billion watched from homes, bars, airports, hospital rooms, anywhere a screen could display the unthinkable. The city seemed to hold its breath as Michael's golden casket, draped in white lilies, was carried beneath soft lights that made it shimmer like it was still alive. Choirs lifted their voices, trembling with sorrow and awe. Some in the audience cried openly. Others stared in disbelief, as though waiting for him to rise and turn the moment into a grand performance. Jermaine stood not far from the casket, feeling each note of the choir like a blow to his ribs. Memories flickered like film. Michael humming beside him as a child, practicing harmonies in the kitchen, laughing backstage, asking quietly for reassurance moments before walking out to face the world. He whispered into the air, a whisper swallowed by the enormity of the room. I'm sorry. I should have told you how proud I was. I thought we had time, but time had slipped away, Dot, and then the moment that broke even the strongest hearts. 11-year-old Paris stepping to the microphone, trembling, her voice cracking as she tried to speak through sobs. Ever since I was born, Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine. A single sentence that dissolved whatever composure remained in the arena. Strangers embraced. Entire rows wept openly. Even the cameras, forced to capture grief, wavered. Jermaine's knees weakened. The sound of that child's pain sliced through him, because in her cry he heard every fracture in their family, every sacrifice, every joy, every loss outside. Thousands held candles and sang "Heal the World," turning the streets into a river of flickering gold. Flowers piled so high around his star on the Walk of Fame that volunteers had to clear space for more. Around the globe, murals appeared overnight, airports played tribute playlists, and churches rang their bells. It felt less like a celebrity death and more like a planetary moment of mourning, Dot, but inside his home, in the days that followed, silence swallowed everything. Jermaine could not sleep, could not eat, could not find a way to speak without breaking. He spent long nights replaying old performances, watching Michael spin beneath lights that seemed brighter than anything earthly. Watching that smile, the one so radiant it seemed to defy gravity. And as he watched, the truth became unbearable. The world had lost a king, but he had lost a brother. A part of his own story had been torn away without warning. Music, yet grief is cruel. It does not wait for healing before delivering the next blow. In February 2012, another voice he cherished fell silent. Whitney Houston, the friend whose talent had electrified him, whose spirit he had admired, whose struggles he had understood in ways only those who endure fame's brutality can, was gone at 48. The world reacted with shock and disbelief. But for Jermaine, it felt like losing a companion in the long, lonely fight to survive a spotlight that never dims. He had known Whitney since the 1980s, when both were rising into heights that promised glory while secretly carving loneliness into their souls. He noticed the brilliance behind her eyes, the strength beneath her softness, the quiet doubts she shared only in private spaces. He understood her need for gentleness, her reverence for gospel roots, her fear of disappointing a world that demanded perfection. In her, he saw a reflection, a star shaped by music, burdened by expectation and longing for understanding more than applause. When the call came on February 11th, 2012, that Whitney had been found in a Beverly Hills hotel room, he froze. No, not her, he repeated, as if saying it could undo reality. The world mourned a legend, but he mourned the friend who once prayed before shows, who rehearsed with a reverence that felt like worship, who confided dreams and fears softly into backstage air. She had carried a light so bright the world forgot she was human. And under the weight of misunderstanding and constant scrutiny, that light flickered until it went out. Her funeral at New Hope Baptist Church, the same place where she first sang gospel as a child, brought a different kind of ache. Watching her casket glide down the aisle surrounded by white flowers, he felt time folding back on itself. He remembered her laughter, her humility, her discipline, the way her voice filled a room like stained glass light. As the choir sang, he bowed his head and whispered, "I wish we could have sheltered you better," because he knew all too well how fame devours gentle souls. For the world, Whitney's death marked the loss of a once-in-a-century voice. For Jermaine, it was losing a kindred spirit, another flame extinguished long before its time. Comment 48, or write "Rip Whitney Houston" to honor her. Music. But sorrow was not finished. Life tore away more pieces of the world he once knew, this time claiming the patriarch who had shaped the family's destiny with a mixture of devotion and harshness. In June 2018, Joe Jackson lost his battle with pancreatic cancer. To the world, Joe was a strict manager, the architect of the Jackson Five, the driving force behind their rise. But to Jermaine, the memory was far more complex. Joe was power and pressure, discipline and fear, ambition and sacrifice tied together. He built the platform they stood on, but the foundation came at a cost. Jermaine mourned him with tangled emotions, gratitude for the opportunities, sorrow for the scars, and recognition that without Joe, there would have been no dynasty, but also no wounds that took a lifetime to understand. Then came January 2024, the loss that quieted him in a different way. Tito Jackson, his brother, the steady guitarist, the calm presence who never chased the spotlight but held the family together in his own gentle way, was gone after a battle with cancer. Tito was the quiet soul of the siblings, dependable, warm, and grounded. Losing him felt like another pillar collapsing, another voice missing from the once loud chorus of their youth, with Michael gone, with Joe gone, with Tito gone. The laughter that once echoed through the Jackson home became a memory so faint he sometimes questioned if it had ever been real. Grief settled in his life like a permanent house guest, never leaving, only shifting from room to room. Comment or write "Rip Joe Jackson" to honor him. Comment or write "Rip Tito Jackson" to honor him.